At 8:20 a.m. on April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle stood on the pitching deck of USS Hornet, watching the waves crash over the bow as his B-25 Mitchell bomber sat 467 feet from the edge. 37 years old, 0 carrier takeoffs, 0 margin for error. The Japanese mainland sat 650 miles west, believing their home islands were untouchable 4 months after Pearl Harbor. Doolittle's B-25 weighed 31,000 pounds. The Wright R-2600 engines needed 44 inches of manifold pressure just to break inertia. Naval engineers had calculated the numbers 3 months earlier at Norfolk. A fully loaded B-25 Mitchell required 3,600 feet of runway to achieve flying speed. Doolittle had 467 feet of carrier deck. The mission existed because Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine officer on Admiral Ernest King's staff, had visited Norfolk in January to inspect USS Hornet. He watched Army bombers practice runs over painted carrier deck outlines on a runway. The idea struck him immediately. Army bombers could launch from Navy carriers to hit Japan. The Army Air Forces had no bases close enough to reach Tokyo. Aircraft carriers could get within striking distance, but carriers couldn't launch their own planes if B-25s filled the flight deck. The mathematics were brutal. The B-25B cruised at 230 miles per hour. Maximum range with standard fuel tanks was 1,300 miles. Tokyo sat 1,500 miles from any friendly airfield. Even if the bombers somehow reached Japan, they couldn't return to the carrier. Landing a medium bomber on a moving flight deck was impossible. The aircraft would have to fly west after bombing, hoping to reach free China before fuel ran out. Doolittle selected the B-25 Mitchell because every other option failed basic physics. The Douglas B-23's wingspan was too wide. The Martin B-26's takeoff roll was too long. The B-25 became the choice by process of elimination. On February 3rd, 2 B-25s were loaded onto Hornet at Norfolk. They launched successfully from the deck. The concept worked in theory. Training began at Eglin Field, Florida in March. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller taught Army pilots short takeoff procedures. White lines painted on auxiliary runways simulated carrier deck dimensions. Pilots practiced lifting 30-ton bombers off 500-foot strips. Some succeeded, some didn't. The aircraft that crashed during training were replaced. The pilots who couldn't master short takeoffs were removed from the mission. Nobody told the volunteer crews their destination until they were at sea. On April 1st, 16 modified B-25Bs were loaded onto Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda. Each bomber carried 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high explosive, 1 incendiary bundle. The lower gun turrets had been removed to save weight. Extra fuel tanks filled the space, giving each aircraft 1,141 gallons. The final 50 gallons rode in 5-gallon cans, ready to top off tanks during flight. Task Force 16 steamed west on April 2nd. Hornet carried the bombers. USS Enterprise provided fighter cover. Cruisers Nashville and Vincennes formed the screen. 4 destroyers patrolled the perimeter. The force was supposed to launch from 400 miles off Japan on April 19th. On the morning of April 18th, a Japanese picket boat spotted the task force at dawn. The fishing vessel Nito Maru transmitted a contact report before Nashville's 6-inch guns sent it to the bottom. Radio intercepts confirmed the message got through. Admiral William Halsey, commanding from Enterprise, faced a decision. The task force sat 650 miles from Tokyo, 200 miles farther than planned. Waiting risked losing 2 irreplaceable aircraft carriers to Japanese counterattack. At 7:40 a.m., Halsey sent the order. Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command. Good luck and God bless you. Doolittle walked to his bomber at 0800, aircraft number 4244. His crew had already completed pre-flight checks. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole verified fuel levels. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter confirmed coordinates. Bombardier Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer inspected the bomb bay. Engineer Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard checked engine settings. The deck pitched 15 degrees in heavy seas. Salt spray soaked the flight deck. The headwind blew at 40 knots. Under normal conditions, that wind would help. But normal conditions involved 3,000 feet of runway, not 467 feet of wet, moving steel. If you want to see how Doolittle's impossible takeoff turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories like this one. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Doolittle. The mission had one absolute requirement. Every bomber had to clear the deck. If Doolittle's aircraft failed to launch, it would be pushed overboard to let the others go. 15 more bombers sat behind him, each positioned closer to the carrier's island. Each subsequent pilot would have more runway than Doolittle. But Doolittle, as mission commander, had chosen to go first with the shortest possible run. He climbed into the left seat at 0815. Cole took the right. The carrier steamed into the wind at maximum speed. Deck Officer Navy Lieutenant Edgar Osborne stood at the bow, watching the waves. His job was to time the launch for the exact moment when Hornet's bow rose on a swell, giving Doolittle an upward angle as he left the deck. Doolittle advanced both throttles to 44 inches of manifold pressure. The right engines roared at 2,400 RPM. The brakes held the bomber against 1,700 horsepower trying to push it forward. At exactly 0820, Osborne dropped the checkered flag. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 lurched forward. Doolittle held the control column neutral as the bomber accelerated across the wet deck. 60 miles per hour. 70. The deck edge rushed toward the nose. 80 miles per hour. Still 20 miles per hour below minimum flying speed. The bomber rolled off the end of Hornet's flight deck. For 3 seconds, aircraft number 4244 dropped toward the Pacific. The right engine screamed at maximum power. The propellers clawed at air. At 95 miles per hour, the wings generated enough lift. The bomber climbed. Doolittle banked left, circling once to let Cole verify their heading. Then he pointed the nose west toward Japan and dropped to wave-top altitude. Behind him on Hornet, Lieutenant Travis Hoover advanced throttles on aircraft number 2. Hoover had 60 more feet of deck than Doolittle. At 0825, he cleared the bow with 40 feet to spare. His bomber joined Doolittle's, flying in loose formation. Lieutenant Robert Gray's aircraft rolled next. Gray's bomber lifted off clean. Then came Lieutenant Everett Holstrom. Then Captain David Jones. One by one, the B-25s thundered down Hornet's deck and clawed into the sky. Some barely cleared the bow. Others had comfortable margins. None crashed. By 0920, all 16 bombers were airborne. The pilots broke formation immediately. Flying solo reduced the chance of detection. Each crew navigated by dead reckoning. No radio contact. No visual landmarks for the first 4 hours. Just compass headings and estimated wind drift across 650 miles of empty ocean. Doolittle flew at 200 feet above the waves, high enough to avoid spray, low enough to stay under Japanese radar coverage. The fuel gauges showed 1,100 gallons remaining. Potter calculated fuel consumption every 30 minutes. The Wright R-2600 engines burned 85 gallons per hour at cruise power. 13 hours to China, 1,100 gallons of fuel. The mathematics worked only if they maintained optimal cruise speed and the tailwind held. At 10:30 a.m., Doolittle's crew spotted a camouflaged vessel on the horizon, possibly a light cruiser, possibly another picket boat. They flew past without breaking radio silence. 1 hour later, they crossed paths with a twin-engine Japanese patrol plane. The enemy aircraft was flying the opposite direction. Neither pilot deviated course. The Japanese plane continued east. Doolittle continued west. The ocean gave way to land at 12:15 p.m. The Japanese coastline appeared exactly where Potter predicted. They had been flying for 4 hours on nothing but compass and calculation. Potter's navigation had put them within 2 miles of their planned landfall point. Doolittle climbed to 1,200 feet. The bombing run required altitude for accuracy and bomb separation. Below, Japanese civilians worked in fields. Some looked up. Some waved, thinking the twin-engine bombers were friendly aircraft. The markings on the B-25s had been changed before departure. The prominent white star on American aircraft had been modified to reduce visibility from below. Tokyo appeared on the horizon at 12:30 p.m. A city of over 6 million people, the largest metropolitan area in the Pacific. Industrial complexes covered the northern districts. Oil refineries lined the waterfront. Doolittle's target was a steelworks and several war production factories in the northern sector. The other bombers approached their targets simultaneously. Hoover's flight of 3 aircraft covered northern Tokyo. Captain Jones led the second flight against central Tokyo. Captain Edward York's flight hit southern sections. 3 bombers diverted to Yokohama. 2 aimed for Nagoya. 1 targeted Kobe. Air raid sirens began wailing across Tokyo at 12:35 p.m. Japanese air defense crews scrambled to their positions. The sirens were routine, training exercises, drills. Nobody in Tokyo believed American bombers could possibly reach the home islands. Pearl Harbor was 4,500 miles east. The Philippines had fallen. Wake Island had fallen. Guam had fallen. American forces were retreating everywhere. The idea that B-25 bombers could appear over Tokyo was absurd. At 12:38 p.m., Bramer opened the bomb bay doors on Doolittle's aircraft. The target was directly ahead, the steelworks. 3 factory buildings, storage tanks, railway sidings. Bramer centered the crosshairs on the largest structure. At exactly 12:40 p.m., he released all 4 bombs. The first bomb was high explosive. It struck the factory roof and detonated inside the building. The second and third bombs hit adjacent structures. The fourth bomb was the incendiary bundle. It separated after release, scattering 48 individual incendiaries across a 200-yard area. Within seconds, fires erupted across the complex. Doolittle banked hard left and dove back toward the deck. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Black puffs of flak dotted the sky. None found the range. The B-25 was already accelerating away at maximum speed, dropping to 500 feet altitude. Behind Doolittle, the other 15 bombers were beginning their runs. Hoover's bomber arrived over northern Tokyo at 12:42 p.m. His bombardier released 4 bombs on an oil tank farm. The tanks erupted in orange fireballs visible for miles. Captain Jones hit a power plant in central Tokyo. The explosions knocked out electrical service to 6 city blocks. York's flight targeted ammunition depots in the southern districts. Secondary explosions continued for 20 minutes after the initial strikes. In Yokohama, Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's crew bombed the waterfront dockyards. In Nagoya, Lieutenant William Farrell's bomber hit an oil refinery and storage facility. In Kobe, Lieutenant Donald Smith targeted an industrial complex producing aircraft components. Every primary target was struck. In almost every case, the highly flammable nature of Japanese construction amplified the damage beyond expectations. Japanese fighter aircraft scrambled from Kisarazu Airfield at 12:50 p.m. 24 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters with long-range tanks, 29 medium bombers armed with torpedoes. The fighters climbed to 20,000 feet, searching for the American formation, but there was no formation. The 16 B-25s had scattered across a 100-mile front, each flying solo at wave-top altitude. The Japanese fighters searched empty sky, while the bombers escaped to the south and west. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air over Tokyo. Thousands of rounds. Not one B-25 was hit by flak. A few encountered light damage from small arms fire. Some crews reported seeing Japanese fighters in the distance, but no bomber was engaged in air combat. The combination of surprise, low altitude, and dispersed flight paths kept every aircraft safe during the attack phase. By 1:15 p.m., all 16 bombers had cleared Japanese airspace and were flying southwest along the southern coast. The attack was complete. 0 American aircraft lost over the target. Now came the hard part, reaching China before fuel ran out. Doolittle checked his fuel gauges at 1:30 p.m. 700 gallons remaining. Potter calculated the distance to the recovery airfields near Chuchao. 900 miles. 13 hours total flight time from Hornet. The fuel would last 14 hours at current consumption. The mathematics suggested they would make it. Barely. But the recovery plan depended on factors beyond mathematics. Chinese forces were supposed to have prepared landing fields. Radio homing beacons should guide the bombers to the airstrips. Ground crews should be standing by with fuel and support equipment. The plan looked solid on paper in Washington. The reality over the East China Sea was different. At 2 p.m., Cole tried raising the Chuchao airfield on the radio. No response. Potter tuned to the emergency frequency. Silence. The homing beacons weren't transmitting. Either the equipment had failed, or the Chinese hadn't received adequate warning to set up the navigation aids. Doolittle kept flying west. There were no alternatives. The unexpected tailwind that had helped them reach Japan now became critical for survival. A 25-mile-per-hour wind from the east pushed the bombers toward China faster than planned. Fuel consumption dropped slightly as ground speed increased. Potter recalculated their position every 15 minutes. If the wind held, they would reach the Chinese coast with perhaps 30 minutes of fuel remaining. Weather deteriorated after 3 p.m. Cloud cover thickened. Visibility dropped to less than 2 miles. Rain squalls swept across the sea. Flying at 200 feet in bad weather over open ocean tested every pilot's skill. No visual references, no radio guidance, just instruments and dead reckoning navigation across 1,200 miles of water. At 4:30 p.m., Gray's bomber developed engine trouble. The left-right R-2600 was running rough. Oil pressure fluctuated. The crew discussed bailing out while still over water versus trying to reach land. Gray kept flying. The engine smoothed out after 20 minutes, but the incident reminded every crew how fragile their situation was. One mechanical failure, one navigation error, one miscalculation of fuel consumption. Any of those meant death in the ocean. The Chinese coast appeared at 6:40 p.m. Doolittle's crew spotted land through breaks in the clouds. Potter confirmed their position. They were within 20 miles of their estimated landfall point after 9 hours of overwater navigation. But the relief was temporary. The landing fields should be visible by now. They saw nothing but mountains and clouds. Fuel gauges showed 150 gallons remaining, less than 2 hours of flight time. Darkness would fall in 90 minutes. The homing beacons remained silent. Cole tried the radio again. No response from any Chinese airfield. At 7 p.m., Doolittle made the decision. They would not find the landing fields in darkness with zero radio guidance. The crew would bail out while fuel and altitude permitted controlled flight. The alternative was flying until the engines quit, then bailing out at night over unknown terrain with no ability to control where they landed. At 7:30 p.m., Doolittle climbed to 8,000 feet. He set the autopilot to maintain heading and altitude. At 7:45, he gave the bailout order. Bramer went first, then Leonard, then Potter. Cole went fourth. Doolittle went last at 7:50 p.m. He glanced at the instrument panel clock before jumping. 9:20 p.m. Exactly 13 hours since leaving Hornet's deck. The B-25 continued flying west on autopilot as Doolittle tumbled through the darkness. All 5 members of Doolittle's crew landed safely in Chinese territory. Doolittle himself crashed through tree branches and hit the ground hard in a rice paddy. He was 70 miles north of Chuchao. Dawn came at 6 a.m. Chinese farmers found him walking along a dirt road. They couldn't speak English. He couldn't speak Chinese. But they recognized the American uniform and led him to the local military commander. Hoover's crew bailed out near the coast at Ningpo. All 5 survived. Gray's crew jumped over mountains southeast of Chuchao. 4 men landed safely. Corporal Leland Factor, the flight engineer gunner, was killed during his bailout attempt. His parachute failed to deploy properly. He fell 6,000 feet and died on impact. 20 years old. The only fatality among Gray's crew. The first American killed in the raid. Captain York's aircraft never reached China. The left engine that had given trouble over the ocean continued losing power. York calculated fuel consumption and knew they couldn't make the recovery airfields. He turned north toward the Soviet Union. At 8:30 p.m., his B-25 landed at a Soviet airfield 40 miles beyond Vladivostok. The Soviets immediately confiscated the aircraft and interned all 5 crew members. The USSR had signed a neutrality pact with Japan in April 1941. Returning American military personnel would violate that agreement. York and his crew would spend 14 months in Soviet custody. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber ran out of fuel at 7:50 p.m. while still over water. Lawson attempted a controlled ditching in the East China Sea, a quarter-mile offshore from Shangqiao. The impact tore the aircraft apart. Lawson suffered severe injuries to his left leg. Co-pilot Dean Davenport was badly hurt. Navigator Charles McClure sustained a concussion. Bombardier Robert Clever broke several ribs. Only gunner David Thatcher could walk. He was 20 years old. Thatcher pulled his injured crew from the wreckage before the bomber sank. He dragged them through the surf to the beach. He built a shelter from wreckage. He collected rainwater for drinking. He kept his crew alive for 2 days before Chinese guerrillas found them. The guerrillas carried the injured Americans to a makeshift hospital in a nearby village. Lieutenant Thomas White, a physician who had volunteered for the mission and flew as gunner on Crew 15, amputated Lawson's leg with minimal medical equipment. The surgery saved Lawson's life. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's bomber also ditched in the ocean. 2 crew members drowned when they couldn't escape the sinking aircraft. The 3 survivors reached shore and were immediately captured by Japanese forces. Lieutenant Robert Meader, Navigator Chase Nielsen, and Hallmark were taken prisoner. They would face trial in Shanghai. Captain William Farrow's crew bailed out over Japanese-occupied territory. All 5 were captured. Co-pilot Robert Height, Navigator George Barr, Bombardier Jacob DeShazer, and Engineer Harold Spatz were arrested along with Farrow. 8 Americans now sat in Japanese custody. The remaining crews scattered across hundreds of miles of Chinese territory. Some landed in Free China, controlled by nationalist forces. Some came down in areas contested between Chinese guerrillas and Japanese occupation troops. Some landed in remote mountain regions where no military forces operated at all. Chinese civilians became the difference between survival and death. Farmers who had never seen Americans before risked their lives to shelter the raiders. Villagers shared food despite their own poverty. Guerrilla fighters guided injured airmen through Japanese patrol areas. Catholic missionaries provided medical care and translation services. Father Herbert Vandenberg, an American priest at a mission compound in Linchuan, received letters from nearby missions in Poyang and Yihuang. Local priests had sheltered several raiders. The airmen arrived on foot, tired and hungry. Their clothing was torn from climbing down mountains after bailing out. The missionaries gave them fried chicken. They dressed wounds and washed clothes. Nuns baked cakes. The priests gave up their own beds. By April 23rd, 5 days after the raid, 64 of the 80 raiders had reached safety in Free China. Doolittle and his crew arrived in Chungking on April 25th. Other crews trickled in over the following week. Most had walked between 50 and 200 miles through enemy territory with Chinese help. In Washington, officials spent those 5 days in anxious silence. They had heard nothing from Doolittle. Radio intercepts showed Japanese claims that 9 American bombers had been shot down over Tokyo. The New York Times published the Japanese statements. U.S. officials floated stories to reporters suggesting the raid might have been executed without direct orders from Washington. They were preparing to distance themselves from what looked like a failed mission. On April 28th, Doolittle's first report reached Army Air Force's headquarters. 71 of 80 raiders were accounted for. Most were safe. 5 were interned in the USSR. 3 were confirmed dead. 8 were missing and presumed captured. Every target had been bombed successfully. Not one aircraft was lost to enemy action over Japan. President Roosevelt announced the raid publicly on April 29th. When reporters asked where the bombers had launched from, Roosevelt smiled and said they came from Shangri-La, the fictional Himalayan paradise from the novel Lost Horizon. The joke became legend. When the Navy commissioned a new Essex-class carrier later that year, they named it USS Shangri-La. In Tokyo, Japanese military leaders were not amused. The raid had exposed a catastrophic weakness in homeland defense. American carriers could approach within 600 miles. Army bombers could launch from those carriers. The bombers could strike Tokyo and escape. The entire defensive strategy for the home islands had failed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, immediately accelerated plans for a decisive naval battle. He would force the American carrier fleet into combat by attacking Midway Island in the Central Pacific. The American carriers would have to respond. The Japanese fleet would destroy them. The Doolittle raid made Midway inevitable. In eastern China, Japanese forces began mobilizing for a different kind of response. The Japanese military issued operational orders on April 24th, 6 days after the raid. 53 battalions from the Imperial Japanese Army would sweep through Zhejiang province. The official objective was to destroy airfields that could support future American attacks. The unofficial objective was punishment. The Chinese civilians who had helped the raiders would pay a price beyond comprehension. The operation was called the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Campaign. It would last 3 months. It would cover 20,000 square miles. It would involve coordinated attacks by infantry, artillery, and chemical weapons units. Japanese commanders made clear that this was retaliation for Chinese assistance to American airmen. The campaign began on May 15th. Japanese forces moved into Zhejiang province from 3 directions. The first wave targeted the airfields near Chuchao and Yushan, where the B-25s were supposed to have landed. Engineers destroyed the runways with explosives. They burned hangars and fuel depots. They dismantled radio equipment. Every facility that could support American aircraft was rendered unusable. The second wave moved into villages and towns where raiders had been sheltered. Japanese troops entered Ihuang on May 20th. The town had a population of 8,000. Missionaries there had fed and clothed several American airmen. Japanese soldiers went house to house. Anyone suspected of helping Americans was executed on the spot. Buildings were burned. Food stores were destroyed. By May 23rd, Ihuang no longer existed as a functioning town. Linchuan fell on June 5th. Father Vandenberg and the other missionaries fled before the Japanese arrived. The Catholic church that could hold 1,000 people was stripped of everything valuable, then set on fire. The hospital where raiders had received treatment was demolished. The town's population of 50,000 scattered into the countryside. Those who remained were systematically killed. The pattern repeated across dozens of towns and villages. Japanese forces would arrive. They would interrogate locals about American airmen. Whether people had helped or not made no difference. Entire communities were wiped out as examples. Wells were poisoned. Crops were burned. Livestock was slaughtered. The Imperial Japanese Army was ensuring that no Chinese civilian would ever help American forces again. Biological warfare units deployed in late June. Unit 731, Japan's covert biological weapons division, released cholera, typhoid, and plague pathogens in water supplies across Zhejiang province. The diseases spread rapidly through populations already weakened by violence and starvation. Medical missionaries estimated that disease killed more Chinese civilians than direct military action. By August, the campaign expanded beyond Zhejiang into Jiangxi province. The operational area covered both provinces where most of the raiders had landed. Japanese forces moved through the region like a destroying wave. Conservative estimates from missionary records and Chinese government reports documented 250,000 Chinese civilian deaths. Some estimates went higher. The exact number would never be known because entire villages were erased with no survivors to report casualties. American intelligence received fragmentary reports through missionary channels. The details were horrifying. Father Vandenberg's accounts reached DePaul University archives. Other missionaries filed reports with their home organizations, but the full scale of the devastation wouldn't become clear until after the war ended. In Shanghai, the 8 captured American raiders sat in prison cells. Hallmark, Meter, Nielsen, Faro, Height, Barr, DeShazer, and Spatz. The Japanese government hastily created a new law, making it retroactive to April 18th. The law declared that enemy airmen who bombed Japanese civilians or civilian facilities could be executed. The trial took place in October in a Japanese military court. All 8 Americans were charged with bombing and strafing civilians in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya. The trial lasted 2 days. No defense was permitted. The outcome was predetermined. On October 15th, all 8 were found guilty. All 8 were sentenced to death. International law protected prisoners of war from execution. The Geneva Conventions specified treatment standards, but Japan argued these weren't prisoners of war. They were war criminals who had attacked civilian targets. The distinction meant nothing under international law. The executions would be murder, regardless of Japanese legal semantics. On October 19th, the Japanese government announced that 5 of the death sentences had been commuted to life imprisonment. No explanation was given for which 5 or why. Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz remained under sentence of death. The 3 condemned men were held in Shanghai's Bridge House prison, a facility known for torture and abuse. They were kept in solitary confinement. Guards provided minimal food and no medical care. Conditions in the prison were deliberately brutal. On October 15, 1942, Exactly 6 months after the raid, Japanese guards took Hallmark, Faro, and Spats from their cells. They were driven to a cemetery outside Shanghai. At 3 p.m., a firing squad executed all 3 men. 25 years old, 24 years old, 21 years old. The first American airmen executed by Japan during the war. Maeder, Haidt, Barr, Nielsen, and DeShazer remained imprisoned. They were moved to a military prison at Nanking. Conditions there were worse than Bridge House. Food rations provided barely enough calories to prevent starvation. Medical care was non-existent. The cells were unheated through winter. Maeder died on December 1, 1943. Malnutrition, beriberi, dysentery. 27 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside Nanking. The 4 surviving raiders remained in Japanese custody. 40 months in prison. Haidt, Barr, Nielsen, and DeShazer would not see freedom again until August 1945, when the war ended. In the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto's plan to destroy American carriers at Midway was moving forward. The raid on Tokyo had humiliated the Japanese military. It had exposed the vulnerability of the home islands. Yamamoto needed a decisive victory to restore confidence and eliminate the carrier threat. The operation was scheduled for early June. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor intercepted Japanese naval communications in May. They identified Midway as the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received the intelligence on May 20th. Japanese carrier forces would attack Midway on June 4th. The operation would involve 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 11 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers, the largest naval force Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor. Their objective was to draw out and destroy the American carrier fleet. Nimitz had 3 carriers available: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea 2 weeks earlier. Shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor estimated 3 months for repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Welders worked around the clock. Yorktown sailed on May 30th with temporary patches and incomplete repairs. The strategic situation was desperate. Japan controlled the Pacific from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. American forces held only Midway, Hawaii, and a fragile line of supply to Australia. Losing the carriers would mean losing the Pacific. But Nimitz had one advantage. He knew where and when the Japanese would attack. He could set an ambush. On June 4th at 4:30 a.m., Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched the first strike wave against Midway Island. 108 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and 0 fighters. The strike force hit Midway's airfield at 6:30 a.m. They destroyed fuel depots, damaged the runway, and set fire to several buildings. But Midway's defenses held. The airfield remained operational. At 7 a.m., Japanese scout planes reported sighting American ships northeast of Midway. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, faced a decision. His aircraft were armed with bombs for a second strike against Midway. Rearming them with torpedoes for ship attack would take an hour. But the American ships might be destroyers or cruisers, not carriers. Attacking them might waste the element of surprise. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered the rearming. Deck crews on all 4 carriers began removing bombs and loading torpedoes. The flight decks became cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft being prepared for launch. At 7:40 a.m., the scout plane clarified the earlier report. The American force included at least 1 carrier. Nagumo accelerated the rearming operation, but the timing was catastrophic. His carriers were in the most vulnerable possible condition. Aircraft spotted on deck, fuel lines running everywhere, bombs and torpedoes stacked in the open. The carriers couldn't launch aircraft. They couldn't recover returning aircraft. They couldn't defend themselves effectively. At 9:20 a.m., American torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Hornet began their attacks. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet went in first. 15 Douglas TBD Devastator aircraft, flying at low altitude. Japanese Zero fighters swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. 14 of 15 torpedo bombers were shot down. Not one torpedo hit a Japanese carrier. Only 1 pilot survived. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked at 9:40 a.m. 12 aircraft. 10 were shot down. 2 torpedoes hit nothing. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed at 10 a.m. 10 aircraft, 7 shot down, 0 hits. The Japanese fighter screen and anti-aircraft defenses were destroying every American attack. But the torpedo attacks had pulled Japanese fighters down to low altitude. The Zeros were focused on killing torpedo bombers. Nobody was watching the high-altitude approaches. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise arrived over the Japanese carriers at 14,000 feet. Commander Wade McCluskey led 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft. Below him, the 4 Japanese carriers steamed in a box formation. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were grouped together. Hiryu operated separately 5 miles north. All 4 carriers had their decks packed with aircraft, being fueled and armed. McCluskey split his formation. Bombing Squadron 6 would hit Kaga, Scouting Squadron 6 would hit Akagi. At 10:24 a.m., the dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs. 70-degree dives from 14,000 feet. The Japanese didn't see them until they were already diving. The first bomb hit Kaga's flight deck at 10:26 a.m. It penetrated through to the hangar deck and detonated among aircraft being fueled. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. 3 more bombs hit within 90 seconds. Kaga was engulfed in fire from bow to stern. Akagi took a single bomb hit amidships at 10:26 a.m. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck and exploded among aircraft armed with torpedoes. The detonation triggered a chain reaction. Torpedoes exploded, fuel tanks ruptured. Within minutes, fire consumed the entire ship. Dive bombers from Yorktown arrived over Soryu at 10:27 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 aircraft. 3 bombs hit Soryu in rapid succession. All 3 penetrated to the hangar deck. The carrier erupted in flames. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning wrecks. The largest carrier force in the Pacific had been crippled by 53 dive bombers. The remaining carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack at 11 a.m. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters found Yorktown at noon. They scored 3 bomb hits. Yorktown's damage control teams fought the fires and kept the ship operational. At 2:30 p.m., Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers scored 2 hits on Yorktown. The carrier began listing and lost power. American search planes located Hiryu at 2:45 p.m. Enterprise launched a strike at 3:30 p.m. 24 dive bombers found Hiryu at 5 p.m. 4 bombs hit the carrier. Hiryu burned through the night and sank at 9 a.m. on June 5th. All 4 Japanese carriers were gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the core of Japan's carrier fleet. 248 aircraft lost, 3,000 sailors dead. The battle continued through June 6th with scattered surface engagements, but the strategic outcome was already decided. Japan would never recover from Midway. They had lost 4 fleet carriers that took years to build. They lost experienced aircrew that couldn't be replaced. They lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific. From June 4th forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive. The chain of causation ran directly from Doolittle to Midway. The raid on Tokyo humiliated Japanese leadership and exposed home island vulnerability. Yamamoto demanded a decisive battle to eliminate American carriers. He chose Midway as the battlefield. American intelligence intercepted the plan. Nimitz set the ambush. The result was the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. Back in the United States, Doolittle received news of Midway in mid-June. He had already been promoted to brigadier general. The raid had been deemed a success despite losing all 16 aircraft. Now the strategic consequences were becoming clear. President Roosevelt presented Doolittle with the Medal of Honor at the White House on May 19, 1942. The citation recognized extraordinary heroism in planning and leading an unprecedented military operation against the Japanese homeland. Doolittle was the first reserve officer to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. He was also promoted 2 grades, from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. Every member of the raid received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Crew members who were killed or captured received the decoration posthumously or while in Japanese custody. The citations were classified. The full details of the mission remained secret until after the war. Official announcements mentioned only that American bombers had struck Japan. The Navy refused to confirm or deny that carriers were involved. Roosevelt's Shangri-La joke became the official story. The psychological impact on American morale exceeded all expectations. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States had struck back against Japan. Newspapers published triumphant headlines. Movie theaters showed newsreel footage of B-25s taking off from Hornet's deck, filmed before the mission launched. The images electrified the public. Americans finally had proof that the war could be taken to the enemy. The raid validated a tactical concept that military planners had dismissed as impossible. Army bombers could operate from Navy carriers under the right conditions. The Army Air Forces and Navy began studying joint operations with renewed interest. The concept of unified command and inter-service cooperation gained credibility. The raid proved that innovative thinking could overcome apparent limitations in equipment and doctrine. Task Force 16 returned to Pearl Harbor on April 25th. Halsey received a Navy Cross for his role in commanding the operation. Captain Mark Mitcher, Hornet's commanding officer, was promoted to Rear Admiral 6 months later. The success of the raid established both officers as aggressive commanders willing to take calculated risks. Their careers would benefit from the association with Doolittle for the remainder of the war. Doolittle expected to be court-martialed when he returned to the United States. All 16 aircraft had been lost. The mission was supposed to recover the bombers in China for future operations. Instead, every B-25 was destroyed. From a purely operational standpoint, the raid was a failure. Doolittle wrote in his autobiography that he assumed he would be demoted and reassigned. General Henry Arnold, commander of Army Air Forces, saw the mission differently. The material losses were irrelevant. 16 B-25 bombers represented a tiny fraction of American production capacity. The strategic and psychological gains were immeasurable. Arnold told Doolittle the raid was the most important single air operation of the war to date. The Medal of Honor and promotion to general followed. The tactical lessons from the raid influenced carrier operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. The Navy recognized that medium bombers could provide capabilities that carrier-based aircraft lacked. Longer range, heavier bomb loads. The ability to strike targets beyond the reach of dive bombers and torpedo planes. While B-25s never operated regularly from carriers, the concept of using land-based aircraft for special missions from carriers remained viable. The raid also validated the importance of surprise and audacity in military operations. Conventional planning would never have approved launching medium bombers from a carrier deck with 467 feet of runway. The numbers said it was impossible. Doolittle proved that careful preparation and skilled execution could overcome mathematical impossibility. That lesson influenced American military doctrine for decades. In China, the aftermath of the raid continued long after the raiders had evacuated. The Japanese campaign through Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces lasted until August. 250,000 Chinese civilians paid with their lives for helping 80 American airmen. The missionaries who sheltered raiders lost their churches, hospitals, and schools. Some lost their lives. The Chinese military and civilian leadership understood the cost, but never questioned the decision to help. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek sent a message to President Roosevelt in June. He acknowledged the heavy Chinese casualties, but emphasized that the raid had been worth the price. The demonstration that Japan could be attacked directly had enormous strategic value. The Chinese people needed proof that their American allies could strike back. The raid provided that proof, even as it triggered horrific retaliation. Doolittle remained in active service for the remainder of the war. He commanded the 12th Air Force in North Africa in 1942 and 43. He led the 15th Air Force in Italy in 1944. He commanded the 8th Air Force in England for the final year of the war in Europe. He participated in planning for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. He retired from active duty in 1946 as a lieutenant general. 71 of the 80 raiders survived the war. 9 died during or because of the mission. 3 were killed in bailouts or crashes in China. 3 were executed by Japan. 1 died in Japanese captivity. 1 was killed in North Africa in 1943. 1 died in a different operation. The 4 raiders who survived Japanese imprisonment were liberated in August 1945 when the war ended. The raiders held annual reunions beginning in 1946. They commissioned a set of 80 silver goblets, 1 for each participant. The goblets were engraved with the names of all 80 men. At each reunion, the surviving raiders would drink a toast using the goblets. When a raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. The tradition continued